there is a kind of pain that no sermon can prepare you for, a kind of grief that no amount of faith, fame, or followers can soften. Rick Warren built one of the largest churches on earth. He wrote a book that sat in the hands of 40 million people. He stood on stages next to presidents. And yet, behind every microphone, every bestseller, every standing ovation, he was hiding a wound that almost broke him completely. This is the story most people never heard. Stay until the end, because the hardest part of this story is not what happened to his body. It's what happened inside his own home. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to go somewhere very few channels are willing to go. Let's start at the beginning, because you can't understand the weight Rick Warren carried later in life without understanding where he came from. He was born in California in 1954 and raised in the small town of Ukiah, a quiet place far from the spotlight that would later define his life. His father was a Baptist pastor, a man who spent decades planting small churches in towns that had almost nothing. Money was tight, recognition was rare, but purpose was everywhere in that house. Rick has talked about hearing his father pray quietly at night, asking for nothing more than the strength to build one more church before he died. Not fame, not wealth, just one more church. That single memory shaped a boy who hadn't even decided what he wanted to do with his life yet. While his classmates were figuring out what sport to play or what girl to ask to a dance, young Rick was already organizing Bible studies. He wasn't chasing attention, he was chasing meaning. Teachers remembered him as intense. Friends remembered him as driven. Nobody around him in Ukiah could have guessed that this quiet, serious kid would one day write a book that would outsell almost everything except the Bible itself. By the time Rick reached his 20s, he had met and married Kay, the woman who would stand beside him through every high point and every devastating low that was still waiting decades down the road. Together, they made a decision that looked, on paper, like a terrible idea. In 1980, Rick and Kay Warren packed up and drove to Orange County, California, with no church building, no congregation, and almost no money. What they did have was a single conviction, that there were millions of people who had given up on church completely, people who felt judged, bored, or rejected by traditional religion, and that those people deserved a place to belong. Their first service happened on Easter Sunday, inside a rented high school theater. A couple hundred curious people showed up. There was no band, no campus, no staff. Just folding chairs and a young pastor with a notebook full of dreams. What followed were years that tested every bit of their resolve. The young church had no permanent home. One Sunday they met in a gymnasium, the next, a tent. Sometimes a school auditorium. Every single week, volunteers had to haul in chairs, sound equipment, and supplies for the kids' area, set everything up, run the service, and then tear it all down again before Monday morning. People joked that Saddleback was a church on wheels, but something kept happening that nobody could ignore. The crowd kept growing, and it wasn't growing because of flashy production or celebrity guest speakers. It was growing because Rick Warren talked about real things, marriage problems, anxiety, loneliness, doubt. He didn't talk down to people from a pulpit. He talked to them like a neighbor who happened to know the Bible really well. Slowly, that tent church with folding chairs became Saddleback Church, eventually one of the largest and most influential congregations in the entire country. And that's when Rick Warren's name stopped being a local story and started becoming a global one. In 1995, Rick released a book aimed at pastors called The Purpose-Driven Church, and it quietly reshaped how an entire generation of church leaders thought about ministry. But that was just a warm-up for what came next. In 2002, Rick Warren published The Purpose-Driven Life, a book built around one simple haunting question: why am I here? Nobody, including Rick himself, expected what happened next. The book exploded. It sold tens of millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. It became one of the best-selling nonfiction books in modern history, sitting on bestseller lists for years, not weeks. Almost overnight, the pastor from the rented high school theater was getting invited to advise world leaders and speak to crowds that had nothing to do with Saddleback Church. He could have used that platform to build wealth most pastors only dream about. Instead, Rick made a decision that surprised even people who already respected him deeply. He chose to reverse his own tithe, giving away the overwhelming majority of his income instead of keeping it. He paid back every salary Saddleback had ever given him. To the public, it looked like remarkable integrity. And it was. But it also meant something else. Every part of his life was now under a microscope. Every word he said in an interview, every theological position he took, every decision at the church, was suddenly being picked apart by millions of people who had never even met him. That kind of pressure would be enough to break most people. But the heaviest blow Rick Warren would ever face wasn't coming from critics, reporters, or theological rivals. It was coming from inside his own home. Rick and Kay had 3 children. Their youngest son, Matthew, struggled for most of his life with severe mental illness, a battle that included deep depression and intense emotional pain that medication, therapy, and endless prayer couldn't fully resolve. For years, the Warrens did everything a family could possibly do. They sought out doctors. They tried treatment after treatment. They sat with their son through his darkest nights. From the outside, Rick Warren looked like a man who had figured out how to help everyone else find peace. Inside his own house, he was a father watching his child suffer in a way he could not fix. No matter how many prayers he prayed or how many resources he had access to, in April of 2013, that battle ended in the worst possible way. Matthew died by suicide at the age of 27. For a man whose entire public identity was built around helping others find purpose and hope, this was almost an unbearable irony. How do you keep telling people that life has meaning when your own son couldn't find a way to keep living? How do you stand in front of a congregation days after burying your child and somehow find words? Rick and Kay didn't disappear after Matthew's death. A few months later, they did something incredibly difficult. They spoke publicly about what happened, openly discussing mental illness in a way that most churches at the time were still too afraid to talk about. That honesty cracked something open. Thousands of families who had been quietly carrying the same kind of pain, often in complete silence, inside their own congregations, finally felt like someone understood. Rick and Kay turned their grief into one of the largest mental health initiatives ever launched inside American churches, training pastors across the country to recognize warning signs and respond with compassion instead of shame. But grief like that doesn't just disappear because you found a way to help other people with it. It lives in the body. And in the years following Matthew's death, that's exactly what seemed to start happening to Rick. He began dealing with serious health struggles, including neurological symptoms that affected how his body handled stress, along with chronic pain and a level of exhaustion that didn't match the image of the tireless, high-energy pastor people had known for decades. Tasks that used to be effortless, flying to another speaking engagement, standing for an hour-long sermon, now came with a cost that very few people in the audience could see. The man who had once seemed unstoppable was quietly running on far less than he used to. And just when his body was demanding he slow down, the church he had spent his entire adult life building found itself in the middle of a public storm. After Saddleback ordained women into pastoral roles, tension exploded with leadership. In the Southern Baptist Convention, the denomination Saddleback had been connected to for years, it became a national story, splitting opinion right down the middle Some saw it as a long overdue step forward. Others saw it as a serious departure from Scripture. Rick didn't dodge the controversy. He defended his position publicly, arguing it was rooted in decades of ministry experience and his own reading of the Bible. Eventually, the dispute led to Saddleback's separation from the convention it had belonged to for years, a split that made headlines far beyond the Christian world. So, picture this moment in Rick Warren's life. A body that was breaking down in ways the public never fully saw. A grief over his son that never fully went away. And a public fight over the future of the church he had built from a handful of folding chairs in a high school theater. Any one of those things could have ended someone's career. Rick was facing all three at once. That's the real context behind the announcement that shocked so many people. After more than 4 decades, Rick Warren stepped down as senior pastor of Saddleback Church. To a casual observer, it looked like a graceful retirement, an aging leader passing the baton at the right time. But underneath that public moment was a much more human story. A man whose body had quietly been asking him to stop for years, finally listening. So where is Rick Warren today? He's no longer standing on the Saddleback stage every single weekend. The pace of his life has changed completely. But the mission hasn't disappeared. It's just taken a different shape. These days, a large part of his time goes into mentoring younger pastors, many of them leading churches in countries with far fewer resources than Saddleback ever had. Alongside Kay, he continues pushing for honest conversations about mental health inside churches that for generations treated the subject like something to be hidden rather than healed. What started as the most painful chapter of his life, the death of his son Matthew, became the foundation of a mission that has likely helped more hurting families than anything he wrote in any of his books. And maybe that's the real lesson buried inside this entire story. Rick Warren is remembered by millions for the purpose-driven life, for building Saddleback out of nothing, for advising world leaders. But the chapters that actually shaped him the most weren't the ones filled with success. They were the ones filled with suffering. A son he couldn't save, a body that started failing him, a church fight that tested everything he believed. It's almost never the easy seasons that define a person's legacy. It's what they choose to do in the seasons that nearly destroy them. So here's a question we're sitting with before you go. When life takes something from you that you can't get back, do you let it close you off, or do you let it turn into something that helps someone else? Rick Warren's story suggests that the second option, as brutal as it is to walk through, might be the only thing that gives pain any real meaning at all. If this story affected you the way it affected us putting it together, do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story in this series. We've got more of these coming, and trust me, you're going to want to be here for them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.